Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for logging in today to Homeroom with Education Leaders, supporting rural students of color. I'm really excited about today's conversation. I think it's going to be a really special one. We have a great panel lined up for you. So I'd like to thank our panelists. We have Superintendent Joan Ebert from Nevada, Superintendent Chris Rakedale from Washington State, Dr. Darius Means from the University of Pittsburgh, and Elaine Townsend-Uten from Latinx Ed. We are very excited about today's conversation. If you have any questions, anything like that, please feel free to submit them into the Q&A throughout the webinar. We'll have someone monitoring that the whole time. Unfortunately, due to the amount of people on the webinar, we won't be unmuting lines. It would just be a little bit too hectic, so please feel free to use that Q&A feature as much as you need it. If you've missed any of our past conversations, you can log on to our website, hunt-institute.org. You'll have all the recordings there of all of our past webinars. There's some really great conversations. Also, if you're going to follow along on social media, please feel free to use hashtag #EdHomeroom or tweet at Hunt Institute's Twitter. And for our format today, we are going to hear some brief remarks, opening remarks from each of our speakers, and then we are going to jump into a full conversation, really trying to get through as many of your questions as we can. So we are really looking forward to it. And finally, I'd now like to get us started by introducing the Hunt Institute's President and CEO, Dr. Javed Siddiqui. He's going to just make some brief welcoming remarks before we dive on in. Javed?
Thank you, Julia. First of all, I want to thank our panelists again for taking time to join us today. I know how busy you all are and appreciate you taking the opportunity to be with us. And thanks to all of you who've made time to join us for this discussion this afternoon. With schools back in session, however that might look in your home districts or in your home states, we know that you're all incredibly busy during this time. Some of the most pressing concerns for students right now are ensuring equitable access to technology, food, healthcare, and other necessities, and specifically supporting Black, Latinx, and Indigenous students who are processing the racial reckoning our country is experiencing. Nowhere are these concerns more tangible than in rural communities with significant populations of students of color. This includes Black communities in the rural South, foreign communities throughout the country that have significant migrant worker populations, and approximately 300 tribal nations within the United States. Many of these communities are grappling with historical trauma, lack of access to healthcare, food insecurity, poor internet infrastructure, and so much more. However, these communities also possess a wealth of resources that are difficult to find, such as strong multi-generational family supports and community schools that work tirelessly to meet the needs of all of their students. So we remain hopeful that the circumstances facing our country will present a unique opportunity. This is a rare time for all educators to come together, to plan, to discuss best practices, to meet the needs of all students. And we're hopeful these conversations will help create some of these solutions. Again, so we're grateful for all of the work our panelists are doing and the leadership they're providing to their states and certainly to our entire country. So thanks again to all of our panelists. And with that, I'll turn it back to Julia to get our conversation going. Julia.
Thank you so much, Javed. And first, we're just going to dive right in. We're going to hear from Dr. Darius Means. Dr. Means is an associate professor at the University of Pittsburgh School of Education. He really focuses specifically on supporting rural students, rural communities, particularly LGBTQ+ students and students of color from those rural communities. So Dr. Means, can you kind of set the stage for us a bit and give us a kind of a high-level overview of what are some of the barriers that rural students of color face around the country, and how has COVID exacerbated some of those barriers, and what is currently working? What are some of the solutions that we're seeing?
So first, I want to say thank you to the Hunt Institute for having this conversation. It's an important discussion that we don't have often enough in education. So I've spent the past 7 years doing research on the social and economic conditions on the local, state, and national level that shape post-secondary education opportunities for rural youth, particularly rural youth of color. And one of the things that I've noticed in this time, particularly since the 2016 presidential campaign, is that there's been this spotlight from the general public, but also the media, on rural America. And while the spotlight has brought attention to the lives of people living in rural communities, to challenges and also the assets of rural people, the spotlight also came with this perpetuation of some stereotypes about rural America, particularly that rural America is the same and everyone who lives in rural communities are the same. Which I think does a disservice and ignores the lives and critical contributions of people of color and indigenous peoples. So disrupting this idea, the stereotype that all people in rural communities are the same is really important, and particularly important for not overlooking the needs of rural youth of color. So some research shows that 1 in 4 rural youth are actually youth of color. In my own work and studying rural Black youth, there's some stats out there that will tell you that 1 in 7 Black youth who are attending public schools are actually rural youth. But also within these populations of color, that there's some major differences. So we can't even treat all youth of color the same. There's differences related to race, ethnic background, social class, sexuality, and social and economic conditions that exist in their own communities. So I think recognizing that there are rural youth of color in our schools and in our communities, that's an important step. But also I think it's important that we're taking a critical approach that we, as we try to figure out how to best address and best support rural youth of color and their families. And so when I say a critical approach, I think it's important that we're not placing the blame on rural youth of color and their families for inequities in education. Instead, we're taking time to recognize the assets, the resources, and networks they bring to education. And also, we need to take time to understand how policies and practices and national narratives perpetuate racism, classism, spatial inequalities, and other forms of oppression. So there's some work that talks about how students of color, rural youth of color, experience more educational barriers on their pathways to post-secondary education. And I imagine with COVID, that has been perpetuated even more so. There's also research that talks about how rural youth experience racial biases in their schools. And there's also work from Dr. Williams from Michigan State and Dr. Grooms from University of Iowa, where they talk about how many state policies and many federal policies that have been developed were not developed with rural schools and communities in mind. And so there's some severe consequences for rural schools and communities when we don't ever center them, but when we particularly don't center rural populations, minoritized rural populations. And so we had to think about how school closure policies, school choice policies, the finance of schools, how they can have a devastating effect for rural schools and communities. Again, particularly the ones that serve a significant population of rural youth of color. And again, the last thing I'll say is my work has focused mostly on post-secondary education pathways for rural youth, particularly rural Black youth. And one of the things that I've heard more and more of is, college is not for everyone. And I think this message has been particularly targeted to rural youth, but also youth of color, this idea that college is not for everyone. And I think these messages are rooted in racism and classism. And I think it does some major damage when we say that some youth in this country can dream big, while other youth are not allowed to dream big and that they have limited possibilities. So I think there's a lot of work to be done to talk about how racism, again, classism and spatial inequalities, how they intersect to inform the experiences of rural youth.
Thank you so much, Dr. Means. That was a really great and succinct overview, and I really appreciate it. I also just wanted to point out to everyone that Dr. Means has been kind enough to provide a list of resources for people who might want to learn more about some of the rural education conversations that are happening in the country, and we'll make sure to post that slide towards the end so that you can take that list down. It's a really great list. So now I'm going to turn to Superintendent Ebert from Nevada. And Superintendent Ebert, could you talk a bit about, what are some of the things that Nevada is seeing right now, some of the challenges that your state is facing for your rural students of color, and what priorities do you have for supporting those students in their communities?
Great. Yes, I'm excited to share with all of you, and thank you to the Hunt Institute for having us here today and all the colleagues online. This is a great forum for us to have this discussion. It's so timely that we are dealing with all of this work because the pandemic has underscored the existing inequities, and specifically for our students of color, as well as those students that are living in our rural areas. So to your question, I wanted to take a moment to set the table for those of you who may not know Nevada's story at the way that we do. In the last fall, a year ago, prior to the onset of COVID, I had the privilege and honor of conducting a listening tour across the entire state. So I visited every single school district to listen and learn from everyone, ranging from administrators, our educators, our staff, our students, our families, our community members. And what I learned was extremely eye-opening, and it's most important to this conversation today. Because I personally had a mindset shift during this time. And what it was is, I spent 25 years in Nevada in the Clark County School District, and it's the nation's 5th largest school district in the nation, 320,000 students. They represent almost 70% of the students in the entire state. And then we have Washoe County School District, which is our 2nd largest. And over the years, and even today, which we're trying to intentionally shift, is people would talk about Clark, Washoe, and the rurals, right? Putting in this broad brush across our rural school districts as if they were one. And in the truth of all of this is that if you visited one rural school district, you have visited one rural school district, because each one is unique, and our districts that are serving our diverse students in these areas really need to have each and every one of their stories told, given their context. And in Nevada, we are home to 4 tribal nations consisting of 27 tribes and bands that are located on reservations across our state. We have our northern and southern Paiute, we have our Washoe tribes, and we also have our western Shoshone. And while our Native American students make up just 1% of our total student population statewide, there are students in 572 of our public schools across our state. And so when we made the shift, the rapid shift from being face-to-face in classrooms and moving to distance learning last spring, we could no longer ignore and say, it's on our radar, those types of things. We had to be intentional and take action and address the disparities in devices, in internet connectivity across our state, as well as looking at professional development and support for our educators, for our students. I call that our people area that we were focused on. And then the third area being high quality instructional materials. And I'm glad that through these learnings, just in this very few short months, in the area of devices and connectivity, being a high priority, the governor's COVID-19 task force spun up urgency around and launched, you can Google this and look at Connecting Kids MV. And what that was is to make sure that every single student, by face, by name, had a device and had internet connectivity. And we know that in our rural areas, it can be extremely difficult. The fact of the matter is that I'm very pleased to report to all of you that we have over 99% of our students in the state who are learning from a distance, have a device, and have internet connectivity today. And that came through several different partnerships and coming together. We had the Western Shoshone Tribe with the Elko Band. They actually stepped up and purchased computers for students in Elko, as well as providing over 350 hotspots and connectivity for those students. In Humboldt County, they identified rural areas where actually no connectivity whatsoever, no matter how hard we tried. But we partnered with the PBS station, and so now families are able to access the same learning materials that the other students were using a Raspberry Pi type of solution. And so that helped fill the gap through those partnerships. We also launched the digital engineers, and I'm really proud to share that with all of you today. I call them our teachers and our administrators who have superpowers. We know that not all of our staff have had the opportunity to teach online and at a distance, but what we did was leverage those educators that have been out there and have been leading the way. And it doesn't matter if you're 4 hours away from another teacher, educator, you actually have access to these digital engineers. And then the last part was critical in finding high quality content and support for our learning environment. So we partnered with Discovery Ed and their experience. And in that area, we actually had Nevada Gold Mine step up and fund a large portion of the professional development and the digital resources that are needed in our rural areas, and that's where our gold mines are located. And so leveraging partnerships during this time have been critical, being intentional, and also transparent. If you visit that website, Connecting Kids NV, we held ourselves accountable every single day, and you will see the numbers of students. They don't end in a 0 or a 5. It ends with every single student, rural, urban, suburban, race identified, is counted, and they have access to a learning environment. So I look forward to sharing other components of our experience here in Nevada with this group today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Superintendent Ebert. And I think that gives a really eye-opening idea of some of the challenges that your state is facing right now. Now I'd like to turn to Superintendent Rakedale from Washington State. And Superintendent, could you similarly tell us, what is Washington thinking about right now when it comes to supporting your rural students of color, and what are some of the challenges you're facing and how are you addressing them?
Thank you very much. Yeah, good to be on with you all. Thank you. I won't reiterate or double down too much on what you've heard. I think there's a really consistent messaging around the challenges we face with remote learning in this time. What I will say is, while we are challenged by technology and distance, I think it's important to note that there's a growing body of work. Dr. Means spoke to some of this in his research, that we also have to be more intentional about the way we talk about race and the way we talk about supporting students who face the intersectionality of a lot of barriers here. And so our state, while we are grappling with connectivity, we think we're basically one-to-one now on the hardware, still struggling a little bit with the reliable broadband or wireless options. We also recognize that we have a critical race conversation to have in the state. So we are simultaneously in the process of building out a more comprehensive ethnic studies, not just a standalone course, but really embedding learning standards at every grade level and across all content areas. Now that's going to take some time to build out, but I guess the opportunity here, we are simultaneously living through a global pandemic at a time where this country in particular is having, I think, a positive and powerful conversation about race that seems to come in multiple waves over periods of time. Each one, I think, has created opportunity, and in some ways, education never really grabbed the momentum from those prior conversations to embed that in our work. We've certainly improved graduation rates. We've certainly improved college access, college going rates. We've made progress, and that's to be celebrated, but it's almost, it's not almost, it's because we've basically tried to make students mold themselves around an existing pedagogy that doesn't really recognize a lot of them. They don't see themselves in their history, their mathematics. It is only recently that I think we've had a more positive conversation about our LGBTQ plus youth. We're trying to be really intentional in this state to bring that learning so that when this moment goes by, both the pandemic and this heightened conversation about race, that we didn't lose the educational opportunity to make permanent change and transformation from it. So I know a little bit later, I think I'll get a chance to talk about some kind of very specific strategies around a particular student population group, but really appreciate you convening this conversation. I would just encourage all those who are watching this to never lose a crisis, never lose the opportunity here. It is about getting through the moment, which is important. We know we're struggling a lot, particularly in the secondary system now in grades in our state. But let's never lose this opportunity right now to permanently transform not just our modalities of teaching, but what we put in our content. And I think we're a state that's trying, not without our faults. And I would encourage everyone to be asking yourself, what will you teach that's differently, not just how, in this moment and beyond. These are times to shake things up for permanent transformation.
Thank you so much, Superintendent. I think that's a really powerful reminder. And I think it also is a reminder that, you know, these rural communities that we're talking about have so many resources that they can offer that aren't necessarily available in other communities. And I think that that's something for us to keep in mind throughout the entire conversation. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Elaine Townsend-Wooten, who is with Latinx Ed. She is the co-founder and co-executive director. And I was hoping, Elaine, that you could talk a bit about the work that you're doing, kind of to my last point, you know, to kind of mobilize some of the Latinx communities in North Carolina.
Thank you so much, Julia, and also to the Hunt Institute. It's an honor to be here with you all and to be actually also absorbing so much wisdom in this panel already. It's juicy and I'm super grateful. To start off with sharing a little bit about my work actually involves me sharing a little bit about my story and who I am, because my identity and who I am very much represents the students that we serve, which is a position that I don't take lightly. It's something that comes with great responsibility, and it's also very humbling and a privilege to be able to serve the community that raised me in particular. So my roots actually start in Peru. That's where I was born, and I came to the US when I was really young and raised in the South, in the rural South. On top of that, you might sense a little accent through this conversation, but I am from Abbeville, Georgia. I'm from Lead Hill, Arkansas. I am from Waxhaw, North Carolina, and Waxhaw, North Carolina is where I've spent the majority of my life. 2 stoplight towns, that is my journey, and being a student and also a Latina in particular, trying to navigate what that meant and learning more about who I was. And there was quite a gap in that journey, especially when I think about the K-12 experience and not having teachers in the class, in my classrooms, or administrators even, that could represent or reflect the culture that I had. I also take this moment to honor 2 very important teachers I had at home, which were my mother and my abuelita, who taught me so many lessons about life, and that really grounded me in trying to understand more about my culture. But there was still a gap, and it was very much felt at school, where I was spending a lot of time trying to make sense of the world and trying to make sense of who I was. And that gap, and also the gap in the curriculum, which it's so exciting to hear Superintendent talking about, like how the efforts to incorporate ethnic studies into the curriculum is such a game changer. That would have changed so much of the experience I had navigating the school system in particular. And it's something that now I have an opportunity through the nonprofit that we've started, which is called Latinx Ed, to also bring that history and storytelling and also healing to our youth that are going through a lot, even 2020, but have been going through a lot for quite some time in the ways that our communities and schools have been structured and built to marginalize our identities, to marginalize our experiences, that are designing, whether that's curriculum, but also experience, without our needs in mind as a community. And then on top of that, I feel like if there's a message you to leave with from this conversation that I think every single one of us have reiterated, is that we're not a monolith, right? Our communities are not a monolith, that we have so much diversity represented in our spaces, in our communities. And when you treat it, you know, like it is a monolith, you're missing out on so much richness that can be tapped into, so much talent, so much wealth when it comes to especially cultural wealth, and ways that we can be really amplifying the talents, the gifts of our students, and nurturing them, not diminishing them or replacing them. And so for us at Latinx Ed, we focus on, and we're actually serving our state and have launched as of September 1st, a virtual college access experience that is culturally responsive culturally led, culturally relevant in particular, but also a bilingual space for students to receive college access support from our incredible staff who also reflect the identities of our students, having been raised in the rural South, also having to navigate the same system, the same experience, and having made it, whether that was to grad school, also to undergrad, and then turning around and opening the door to make sure that our students have the resources that we wish we had. So in many ways, in that program is called College y Consejos, which translates to college and advice. Our first initiative, which is also tying into this conversation so deeply, is called Somos Carolina, which means in English, we are Carolina. And that's, both programs are honestly a love letter to our younger selves, because growing up in the rural spaces that I was in, I did not feel like I was part of the community. I didn't feel like I had a voice in the way that our community was shaping the decisions that were being made. And that's a nod to being a young person, but also in a rural space, and also not being, acknowledged when it comes to my cultural background, but also feeling that divide, not only within myself and from my culture, but also within the community itself. And so Somos Carolina is about positive racial ethnic identity development. It's about what we call the 3 L's. So Latinidad, unpacking what does it mean to be Latinx, but also from your respective culture. What are the gifts and the talents that we get from that cultural background and from that upbringing, and really honing in on the strengths and the wealth that we get from our identity. And then the other 2 L's are actually learning and leadership. And so how do we take who we are and manifest it in our roles, the things that that we should be able to evolve in, the things that we should be able to make mistakes and grow, as that's such a key part of the learning process, but also such a key part of leadership, and trying to figure out how to bring about positive change and transformation in our communities. And so our students, we are working starting in middle school, going all the way up to high school, and having these conversations in a rites of passage format. And our students have already been like, can this be school 24/7? Like this is they're getting access in the space to people that look like them, that have the shared experiences to them, and it is creating a sense of belonging. And that is so important to think about when we have conversations, especially about rural students of color, is how are we thinking about how are we also not I'm going to say, making sure that we are including our students in the conversation, making sure that their needs are also centered in the design choices and processes that we have our authority to make, but also how are we ensuring the sense of belonging and thinking critically about how do we take it to that level. And so I share this a little bit. I'm sure I'll talk a little bit more about our work and kind of how it's manifesting. But this is a really important time to having these conversations that are also they're a long time coming, right? Like these are solutions that we needed to be seeking yesterday, a year ago, several years ago, right? So, but it's never too late, right? To take those steps to informing ourselves and to informing our practice and diving deeper and evolving ourselves. So thank you so much, Julia, for your question.
Yeah, thank you, Elaine. And I also just wanted to let you know that we had someone chat in that we have another Waxhaw native on the webinar. So.
Very exciting.
So now I'd like to turn it over to some question and answer. Once again, if you have any questions, please feel free to chat them into the Q&A or just comments, like we've been getting some of those, which are also always fun. I'm going to start with Dr. Means. And Dr. Means, supporting rural Black students during COVID-19 has been further challenged by some of the unrest and the racial reckoning we're facing, as has been discussed. And also, sometimes in these rural communities, the population can be 90% white, and it's hard to bring up these topics with students because a lot of the teachers maybe aren't equipped to have those conversations and might unintentionally put students of color in the spotlight and make things even worse. And so, can you talk a bit about some supports that rural teachers and rural staff can use to be there emotionally and socially for Black students and their families right now?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. So I wanted to briefly talk about a study that I did during the 2017-2018 academic year. So that study focused on the social, economic, and educational contexts that supported and or hindered access to higher education for rural Black youth. And the study took place in Georgia. And so across these 2 high schools where I was interviewing rural Black youth, it became very clear to me that they were carrying the weight of anti-Black racism on their shoulders. Students talked about things like, no matter what I achieve, people will still view me as being Black. Another student talked about how people perceive that white students will be successful, but that was not the same message that she felt like she was receiving. So across these two studies, there's a sense of this anti-Black racism that students experience, internalize as they're navigating their post-secondary futures. And a lot of these experiences were rooted in what they were witnessing, hearing, and feeling as Black youth in this country. And again, this study took place in 2017 to 2018. So that's a clear indication that anti-Black racism is not new. It's been happening over and over. Actually, it's the foundation, I would argue, of our country when we think about slavery and also Jim Crow laws. And so what needs to happen is, how do we help Black youth feel like they're not the only ones carrying the weight of anti-Black racism on their shoulders? And I think that's going to really require non-Black people of color, as well as white people, to join in conversations to really think about how can we address issues around anti-Black racism. And I keep saying anti-Black racism because I think it's something really important that we talk about, because I think sometimes we will say just racism, but anti-Black racism will disappear sometimes in those conversations. So what are some things that folks can do? I think the first thing that we need to think about is, how are we doing the work ourselves? If you are a teacher, if you are a community member, a community leader, no matter who you are, how are you doing the work to really address attitudes, behaviors that you may hold that's rooted in anti-Black racism? I think it's going to be going beyond just reading a book, but how are you every day choosing to have a conversation and shift, again, your attitudes and behaviors around anti-Black racism? I think sometimes people think anti-Black racism is too big to address, but I think it really starts with our circle of influence. So what can we do as individuals, but also how we show up with our families, how we show up in schools, and how we show up in communities. That matters a lot as well if we're going to see some significant shifts in anti-Black racism. I think the second piece related to, on a local level with schools, is how are we creating affirming spaces for Black youth, rural Black youth, to process anti-Black racism, to cry, to be vulnerable, and at the same time, how do we use those spaces to recognize Black joy, Black success, Black achievement as well? So I think it's going to require us to think about how are we creating those spaces within schools. And I think that begins with what Elaine talked about, talking to rural youth about their needs and what they would like to see, and how that can be factored into our daily practices within schools. So I'll stop there. But the last thing, one more thing I will add, is that once we do identify things that need to happen within our schools, that we don't leave it to Black youth and their families to do all the work. That again, this is going to require the work of everyone to address the implications of anti-Black racism in schools.
Thank you so much, Dr. Means. And I'm just going to jump right into our next questions and keep it moving so that we can get through as many as we can. So Superintendent Ebert, in the Why Rurals Matters report from the Rural School and Community Trust in 2019, Nevada had the highest rate of students that changed school districts throughout the year, with around 20% of students changing districts. And we've seen before that moving school districts, A, is something that rural students are doing more so than a lot of other student groups, and B, make it difficult for students to have a consistent, high quality learning experience. So what is Nevada doing, and what can other schools and districts and states do to support highly mobile students?
So the state as a whole, we've been working on many different strands. And what I really appreciate is that we're not alone in doing this work. One of the things that we have delved in headfirst and pulled on the intellectual capital of other states is that we formed a consortium to develop supplemental online learning tools that support our migrant workers. And yes, we're one of the highest in the nation as far as that goes with our student movement. And so states like Vermont, Virginia, Utah, the Dakotas, and I'll drop it in the chat as well, but Migrant Literacy Net is what we started, and that is helping us as a state to make sure that our students remain connected with their learning as they move within the state. We also are spinning up a similar portal for parents to be able to support their students. The things that we consistently work on, and I'm glad the colleagues here have brought it forward in honoring our students and our parents and all of their backgrounds, whether it is that they're in a transiency family household, that all of our students are welcomed into our school districts and as they move forward, and that they have the same access to learning and that they have access to adults that can support. So the new virtual platforms as we move forward, and we were one of 6 states that was awarded the college and career readiness, which will help make sure that even though a student is in a rural area, maybe as transit, that they all have access to AP courses. Dr. Means entered the conversation early about making sure that it's not just a certain group of students at C College, but all students should see themselves as having access to those courses. And so we're building that out. And we also have students that sometimes go into not only other states temporarily, but into other countries. And we want to make sure that their learning continues. And so with that, we've also set up a virtual high school that the students can enroll in and have access to the curriculum no matter where they are, if it's locally within the state or if it's across the United States. They can still have the opportunity to earn a diploma here in our great state. So those are just a few of the things I would highlight given this time, and I'm more than happy to provide additional details if time allows.
Thank you so much. And then Superintendent Rakedale, we're going to turn to a question that's really personal to me due to my teaching experience, but states like Washington, which have a higher than average share of Native students, they often find it difficult to attract and retain high quality teachers to primarily Native schools, particularly high quality Native teachers to primarily Native schools. Additionally, many of the teachers don't share a similar background or culture and often find themselves not staying or not being able to support their students in the way that their students deserve. So what are states like Washington doing to support the recruitment and retention of high quality, culturally responsive, community oriented teachers in Native schools?
Great, thank you very much. Just some context quickly. We have 29 federally recognized tribes in the state of Washington. I come to you from the ancestral lands of the Squaxin Island Nation, just a remarkable tribe in the South Puget Sound area, about an hour south of Seattle. There are lots of strategies here that we have had in place and increasingly are trying to build capacity and strength around. First, I would say, as you've heard from others, people with white privilege like I have cannot be the leadership of this. We can be allies and support this and bring our expertise, but you also really need to center it on those who experience it directly. So one of the things, for example, is we've brought back our Native Education Advisory groups. Our agency, our SCA, our state education agency, has multiple advisory groups, students with disabilities, migrant bilingual, but this has been a lagging group for us. And so we've brought it back and really tried to build capacity around them delivering and driving the policy agenda around support. So a couple of things. We're the only state in the country that took our most recent Regional Comprehensive Center grant, and we've exclusively focused it on Native youth and the development of our young Native students. We want all of that work to center around student achievement around those students. We have tribal compact schools in the state of Washington. Some other states do this as well. It is not to say that our students are all wholly contained in our tribal compact schools. We have 6 or 7 of them now. Most of our Native youth are actually in traditional public schools. And so there's 2 things there: building out these compacts, which really means the tribe itself is its own school district. They are either a board of tribal leaders as a school board, or tribal council leads that work. And then we work in a compacting relationship to ensure they get all the access to basic education dollars, all federal dollars that they're entitled to. We're trying to build out capacity for them to get access to capital budgets. So one of these questions about how do we strengthen and see and empower communities, particularly Native youth, is put them in the center of the policy development and ultimately put them in the center of decision of resource allocation. That's what the Tribal Compact idea is about. On the other hand, we have a lot of tribal youth who are in our traditional school systems. And so part of that Region 16 grant in our work here is to do what we call tribal consultation. And some of you are familiar with this. Our tribal nations are sovereign nations. They are sovereign nations. So we have to have government to government relations conversations about how to support tribal youth who live on sovereign tribal land, but they attend a public school, either off that land or even contained on it. And that means school boards, separately elected, have to have a government to government relationship. What does the tribe expect of their young people? How can supports better be aligned? How can resources be partnered? And so we've got districts who do that exceedingly well, and we've got many who just are new to the whole concept. So really would encourage folks to think about what government to government relationships look like there. We have expanded our bilingual grant program. We have 40 districts in our state now who offer this. We explicitly offer this to our tribal compact schools and others who want to make sure we retain native languages in this state. We are at risk of losing them. A lot of oral tradition, but increasingly some expertise around putting some formality around that language and writing and making that a language, just as many of our students learn Spanish here, some Russian, lots of languages on the Pacific Rim. We want students to be able to become bilingual in native languages in our state. A couple other things, our beginning educator support program. It is not enough to recruit folks who come from one of our native communities. If they don't feel the mentorship and the support and the partnership when they're in our school districts, they are often the only person in their school district who comes from that background, and they need support. Statewide regional networks as well as in the district. That means job embedded professional development for all educators becoming more racially literate around this question. Last two things, CT equivalencies. We have a lot of tribes who want traditional industries to survive and thrive, and we keep trying to force every kid in this country into a 24 credit model of seat time, and ours is a state that's been trying to make sure that students who are really active and engaged in their tribe or in their community and hands-on technical learning get equivalencies. So rigorous math in there, rigorous English language arts and writing skills, but give them the credit for that so they can thrive in those communities and still make academic progress towards post-secondary. And finally, if we have learned nothing from this COVID situation, it's that our rural communities, particularly tribal communities, tend to be very rural, and they tend to be small. So they don't have the comprehensive offerings of other schools. So when I hear folks say, well, I just don't have enough scale here to mount an entire calculus class, that might have been an excuse 10 years ago, but now you are connected. Now you are interconnected. It's 2 students in the Yakima area. It's 4 students out on the coast. It's 3 students in the North Puget Sound. We can build classrooms of calculus and advanced course taking to really empower young people. They're ready for it way beyond what the adults are ready for right now in the system. COVID forced us to think about learning with some tremendous failures, but also like no more excuses now. We need to be bringing high quality coursework and opportunities for post-secondary transition to every community. We've built out the infrastructure. You heard about this in Nevada. It's happening all over the country. Huge opportunities now to really get to communities who are very, very isolated. There is more. I am so proud of the work we're doing, but we also have a lot of work to do. But would encourage you all to be very tactical about centering the work around the communities who have the voice and have the experience, and then be allies in bringing the resources to them in an innovative way. That's what we're trying to do here.
Thank you so much, Superintendent. And then I'm going to jump now to Elaine. We're getting so many questions sent in, and they're all really great. And so trying to really cover as many as we can. We've gotten a lot of questions around data and the importance of data around rural communities and rural schools, particularly now with COVID, and figuring out which students have access, which students are remote learning, all those sorts of those questions. So Elaine, how can the collection and the usage of high quality data address help us to address some of these challenges when it comes to supporting students?
Yes, this is a juicy question. It's the one that should be on our minds too, and it's on my mind for sure. So I'm going to answer this in the context of my community and also my when it comes to North Carolina, also thinking about the Latinx population here in particular. So to share a little bit of data, let's start off with that. So we have over 1 million folks here that identify as Latinx in North Carolina in particular. And so when we think about the increases of Latinx enrollment, specifically in public schools, that enrollment has increased. Or I would say let me get my facts right here, but Latinx students make up 97% of that increase in enrollment. So we are here. This is, and back to what Superintendent Chris was saying, this is no longer optional, right? To be thinking about the needs of our students in our spaces. Now, when we get to even thinking about our rural communities, and in particular one that we serve, which is Lee County, and just kind of use Lee County as an example, but 1 in 4 students in Lee County identifies as Latinx, right? So in particular, we're seeing our rural communities continue to have a larger Latinx population more quickly, and it's increasing. And back using Sanford in Lee County as an example, that their population is almost 30% Latinx. So what does that mean for our schools? And I think when it comes to thinking about how are we considering the data and then turning it into action? How do we take that and make it a consideration and also a reality for our students? Because back to this piece that it is no longer optional to think about, should I hire a diverse, teaching force? Like we're well beyond that in that conversation. But again, like, even though we are late when it comes to thinking about these aspects of the structure and the systems that we have, it's better better now than never, right? To be thinking about the changes and the resources that we can be bringing to our schools. But I also want to add another nuance here. I think if we look at the data, data can be used as a truth-telling tool, and it can also be used for people to hide behind. I think when it comes to some stats, even like Latinx, the Latinx population in North Carolina making up, let's say, 10% of our population at large, people could say, well, the 10%, that's not a lie, right? Like, we can really hide behind this idea of like, well, that's not the majority. But here's the thing is that when you break down that data by school districts, especially in rural areas, you're going to see a higher proportion of students in specific districts that are Latinx, but they're also the least resourced school districts in our state in particular. And so it's something to think really critically about. And especially if we're thinking about the forecast and the trend of the systems that we have right now and where we're headed, we need to invest in our rural spaces more than ever, and really acknowledge the marginalization that has happened, and that is historical, just as much as current. The other piece I wanted to bring up, and I've been unpacking this a lot because I think I'm reflecting on my own journey. I have a complex relationship with data. So I think one of the pieces that data can be used as a map, right? It is a compass. It can be so often the flashlight that's helping us identify the problems. And then it gets to that, how are we going to fix it question, right? How are we going to take that data, not just sit on it, and also not just like admire the problem too? That's another thing that's, I think, is easy to fall into that trap of just admiring the data, admiring the problem. And it also, at the same time, I think when we're looking at it and drawing conclusions and making our recommendations, it also isn't mind-blowing, to see the disparities that are in our community. And unfortunately, like these are conversations that we've been having for decades. And so how does that translate into political will, even to transform our communities? How are we going to really muster that will to work on these issues? And that piece of action, again, that's something that is really resonating with me. And how do we really take the truth that we are learning and the truth that our communities and that our students are telling us? They're telling us their experiences, right? Like, these are things that we can learn if we're listening, right? And if we're open to also evolving and making critical decisions. And I think Dr. Means mentioned this too, is like, how are we acknowledging the power that we have, especially in whether it's our leadership position, maybe it's the positional authority that you have. How are you using it to really create change, but also maybe even to share that decision-making power, and making sure that the people who are making the decisions in our communities also are reflecting the populations that are in our communities. And when that's not happening, we're so often seeing the inequalities continue to replicate itself and continuing. This is why I still have a job, right, is because they're trying to create this change for our students. But for us, it also means dismantling and reimagining a learning environment, a school system, right, that really centers and honors the wealth that is in our community and in our students. And so I will leave one piece, and I know there's a lot of questions, but I was listening to two of our students had a Instagram live yesterday, and it was juicy, all about the first generation college experience. And one of the pieces of advice that the student offered, Brian, giving a shout out, was that the question was like, what advice would you give educators, administrators, counselors, advisors that support first generation college students? And I think this advice can translate to especially serving students of color, in particular rural students of color. But he said, ask better questions. And he took, and that piece of advice there is like, where are, what truth are we trying to seek? How are we reckoning with the answers too that we receive, right? But thinking critically about how are we reaching out to, how are we building relationships? How are we listening to others and making sure that their needs are centered and also addressed and considered, so that we can truly make a shift towards equity. And that also looks like, dismantling the system, name that too, but also the freedom dreaming that Dr. Bettina Love, I think Dr. Means also shared her book in the resources, but talks about his freedom dreaming too, and how challenging too it is to dream of a world that doesn't have all of these systems of oppression, not to just continue replicating it, because that's the way it's always been done. It's going to require an incredible amount of compassion and also creativity to really stretch our minds. And it also starts within us too, right? And doing the work within us, and how are we releasing those chokeholds that we've also become subject to. So that's a lot, but again, I'm unpacking a lot of my own relationship with data, but it's an important one. So thank you for that question, Julia.
Yeah, thank you so much. And your passion really shines through, so we really appreciate it. And we love having you on here. I have a question that Superintendent Ebert, I think, wanted to answer from the chat. And this is around elders. And so, a lot of people learn from elders, particularly in rural communities. It's a very important part of the culture of rural communities. But it's getting challenging to find new elders to stay in rural areas, because so many young people are told to leave their towns and experience more of the world. And, we hear the get out phrase a lot, get out of this town and that sort of thing. So how can we help and encourage people to come back home and work and live in their communities? So Superintendent Ebert, I'll start with you. And then if anyone else wants to jump in on this question, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you. I jumped in on the chat on that one really quickly to add for everyone, is starting right there, right in the local, recruiting the children that are on the land, changing that mindset. So we have actually had the universities, all of the education, right, pushing it out and knowing that the learning can happen where they're at. And so our universities have been wonderful. In some of our most remote areas, they actually have the student teaching experience there. And when they have that student teaching experience there, they tend to stay. And then also too with language, one of the languages that we're losing is the Washoe language here locally, which is where I am. And Chris, thank you for identifying where you are as well. And so making sure, again, the intentionality that, this is happening, but what are the action steps that you're putting in place, and making it in the local context, working with the community, and not saying, hey, let's come, and have a meeting 200 miles away. And now we don't need to have that with the virtual, but I think that's very important. And we've seen great success in increasing the numbers of teachers, new teachers wanting to come and teach in those areas.
Thank you. And unfortunately, this hour went so quick. We are running short on time. We were able to answer some questions in the chat. I also wanted to flag for everyone that we are working on putting together a Twitter town hall, where we will address some of the other questions that we weren't able to get to. That will be coming next week, and I'll make sure to send out an email to all of our attendees letting them know when that's scheduled officially. I think I want to do one more question to wrap up, maybe just a quick round robin with just, 15 to 20 seconds, maybe 30 from each of our panelists. And, this one was chatted in, and I think it's a really great and thought-provoking question. With the education system built to function in ways that harm and oppress Black, Brown, Indigenous, and other people of color, what can we do to leverage the pandemic as an opportunity? And I think this is something that Superintendent Rigdale really touched on earlier. How can we redesign the system right now? And how can we tangibly put that decision-making power in the hands of people in these communities? So I guess I will start with Superintendent Rigdale, and then we can just go to Elaine and Dr. Means, and then Superintendent Ebert to close us off.
Yeah, at the risk of offending a lot of really smart people in the world, this is a moment right now for us to think about deep learning instead of covering so much content. And when you think about that concept, it means knowledge is so ubiquitous and young people are better than the rest of us at accessing it. But it means changing the mindset of education around relationship building, an understanding of the contribution of folks, the connectivity by race, by sexual orientation. We have students who want to connect, and their ability to do that is the driving determination of their success in school, not whether they get that fourth math class, that third science class, which is very important. Content is very important. But we have ways now to leverage technologies that we're learning in the pandemic to give students the ability to get the content they need and the pacing that they need on that content. But the difference maker in the lives of young people is their ability to see themselves in the teaching and the learning. That should be the emphasis of this country's education system for the next 20 years, is connecting people to that powerful relationship building. Content's important, but it can take a little bit of a different shape nowadays to focus on seeing students in their studies. Ethnic studies is not a standalone course. It should be a way of life in education, and I hope we can lead a little bit, and I hope we can learn a lot from folks who are further ahead than us.
Thank you. Elaine, any thoughts?
I just want to piggyback on that. Yes, amen. And also, I think when we're thinking about mindset shifts, for me, it's been questioning and the reoccurring examining of, am I being transactional or relational? And that fundamental question as you're making decisions it's a helpful guide, because the system and the way it's built up is really meant to be transactional, right? For that purpose of production, and not necessarily centering the wealth and the wealth and well-being of our students in particular. And so I think that question of how am I being relational in the decisions that we make has been a really important mindset. Oh, sorry, I don't know if I froze, but it's been an important mind shift that I think we've seen across 2020 as well, when it comes to people being more considerate of each other, because we are in a global pandemic. There's a layer of compassion that has come out of the suffering from this year too. And I think if we continue to lean into that, the healing process of that comes when we are being relational, and making sure that healing process is also a collective experience for our teachers, for our students, for our community members, for our parents. We all have a role to play in that process.
Thank you so much, and sorry for my quick interruption there. I froze a bit. And Dr. Means, any thoughts there?
Yeah, I'll just share from a perspective of an educational researcher. I think as researchers, we spend so much time theorizing and doing work on populations, particularly rural youth and youth of color. And I think it's an opportunity to really say, how can we collaborate with rural youth, again, particularly rural youth of color, to do this work, to study pressing issues, and think about ways that we can reimagine how to solve these pressing issues in education.
Thank you. And then Superintendent Ebert, let's closing this off.
So rounding out, not wasting a crisis, really looking at ensuring that we're meeting our students where they're at. And so we're taking a look at chronological age, right? That's how we've been moving children through a system, and wiping that out, and really looking at where our students are at, what they know, what they're able to do, leveraging their culture, leveraging what they bring to the table, all of the children, and moving forward from that heart that we know in education, working with our children, bringing them forward. And so building that system out collaboratively with everyone is what I think will help to everything that my colleagues have said as well.
Thank you so much. This was a really wonderful panel, and I am thrilled that all of you were able to be here today. We've just got a couple housekeeping things. If you could bear with me for a couple minutes, I'd really appreciate it. So thank you again to all of our panelists. Thank you, Superintendent Rakedale. Thank you, Superintendent Ebert. Elaine, Dr. Means, thank you so much. We really appreciate your insight and your thoughtfulness. For our upcoming webinars, we'll have another homeroom webinar next month, December 15th. I will be on the lookout for some more information there. This webinar has been recorded. I will make sure to personally email all of you and get out that information afterwards, that we'll have the recording and some takeaways and information about the next webinar. I also just wanted to, as promised, point out these resources here. Thank you, Dr. Means, for sending these along. We have Bell Hooks, Bettina Love, Mara Teakin, and I'm not familiar with the first name of the last author, but some really great resources here. So I hope that you check them out. I've also set them into the chat. I also just wanted to make you aware we have an awesome webinar coming up tomorrow, or excuse me, Thursday, November 12th, 7 p.m. Eastern. There we go. And we are thrilled to have Secretary Spelling, Secretary Duncan, Chancellor Carranza from New York City, and Superintendent Cavaro from Miami. So please, we would love for you to register. And the link has been sent into the chat by my colleague, James Michalowski, just now. So you can register right now and get that all set. Once again, please keep an eye out for future webinars. The Hunt Institute has a lot coming up. We have our Race and Education series, our post-secondary pathways series, our early effort series, and our governing principles series, in addition to the homeroom series. So there's a ton of resources, and you can find them at our website listed here. Thank you once again. I really appreciated all the input today, and we will keep you updated about the Twitter Town Hall next week. So thank you, everyone.